species, say. Now, I mentioned obviously a lot of the evidence that we have for that is archaeological, and that would involve large-scale excavations of particular sites in order to be able to retrieve that kind of evidence. But we're also able to use place name evidence to help us understand the growth and development of the Anglo-Saxon landscape. And so what I want to do for the next little section here is just to present a series of local place names and just look at how we can use the place names which become attached in this early Anglo-Saxon phase and which continue right the way through to the present day in some cases, and what that can help us understand about the nature of the early Anglo-Saxon landscape itself. Now, of course, this is a subject with a long history, and there are many key books out there which you can look at. I will, as I did last time, send round a list of links to different online resources that you can use. That list of links will be available through the YouTube channel as a link beneath the video if you wish to download those later. But on that reading list, I will include some of the books that you can see on the screen, for example, including on the left, the classic work Signposts to the Past by Margaret Gelling, which was published about 40 years ago now, but really which set the ball rolling in terms of the popular appreciation of place name studies and what place names can tell us about the landscape. In the centre there, you can see a book published a few years ago now by the Suffolk Institute for Archaeology and History, together with the English Place Name Society, a dictionary of Suffolk place names, you can see, which, as the name suggests, gives you a rundown of all of the different place names in Suffolk and their meanings. And again, it's an incredibly useful and interesting book. And then on the right hand side, a slightly briefer but general overview of place names from across the country. And again, you can look up all the place names that you're interested in. And place name studies is in some ways akin to a cryptic crossword, I suppose, in many ways. The idea is that you're taking the place name as it survives today, you work back through historical sources looking for earlier versions of the place name, and then when you get your earliest recorded instances of those names, you can then start to use those to offer something of an interpretation about what that place name means. And in terms of some of the local names, there are patterns and trends that we see within those names. And if you look in the books that I've mentioned, you'll find that those patterns extend from many different periods. There are many different languages, many different periods of history represented in the place names of the landscape. I'm just going to focus in on a few of them to do with the early Anglo-Saxon period in particular, just to give us an idea of how we might approach that. And so one of the first names I'm going to start with is Thetford, which obviously sits towards the centre of our study area and highlights one of the early trends that we see in Anglo-Saxon place names, which is using topographical features as part of a place name. And in this particular instance, of course, we're looking at the ford element of Thetford, literally the ford of a river. And of course, those of you who know Thetford know that there are two fords across the river, or rivers within Thetford, and that is one of the main reasons why the settlement is located where it is. And if we look at the Thet part of the Thetford place name, we can see that that's derived from the Old English for theod, which is people or tribe or region. And so the literal translation of the place name Thetford from the Anglo-Saxon period is the people's ford. And so we can see how that might help us understand how that works. Of course, there are other ford names within the study area, and I've really just picked a few off the map at random and given them to you. But again, if this is something that starts to interest you, this is a hobby which will occupy your every waking moment. So you can start to get maps out, you can start to look at this in enormous amounts of detail. And it does make you a very dangerous driver as well, I can promise you that. So we've got, for example, within the study area, we've got places like Culford, which translates as Cooler's Ford. And here we have a personal name, Cooler, an Anglo-Saxon name being attributed to a particular ford. And this again is giving us a sense of the local hierarchy, if you like, who the important people are in the local landscape, who the settlements are managed by, and so on. Another place name, Wangford. Again, we have a few of these across East Anglia, but the one I'm thinking of here literally translates as wagon ford. Again, perhaps an indication that here we have a crossing where a wagon can ford the river. So again, it's quite simplistic in some ways, but we can start to read the landscape in this fashion. And Lackford, for example, again, here we're looking at Lacu, which is the Old English for a stream. So we're looking at the ford and the stream here. So again, a very, very literal interpretation of what a ford actually is, but it gives you this idea of how the landscape is being named by these early Anglo-Saxons. Just to broaden that out, I mentioned in the last session about the cemetery at Lakenheath, which has a very extensive Anglo-Saxon cemetery. Well, there are 3 actually on the site within the RAF base, and one of those cemeteries has burials such as the one you can see on the screen here, which is a warrior buried with his horse, and a very high status burial indeed. And the excavation report for Lakenheath is due to come out fairly soon and should be fascinating when it does. But just to take a quick look at the place name for Lakenheath, which is quite interesting, and see what that tells us. The suggestion from the excavations was that this was a very early Anglo-Saxon settlement, as it were, right the way back into the 5th century, and that we might be looking at some of the first people to settle within the Brecks and Fen Edge area. And so with the Lakenheath place name, again, we have that Lacu place name element. So you've got the stream and the watercourse being represented there. Again, that gives us the Lac element. We've got in the N in the middle there, we've got an Ingas part of a place name. So Ingas is an element that we find in place names which gives us a sense of the people of, and so anything that ends in Ingas or has Inga in it tends to be indicating some sort of territory or some sort of tribal region of sorts. And so we've got that in the middle. And then towards the end here we have this Hythe sound, which then translates into heath later on in our particular instance. And in Old English, that sound gives us a landing place or an inland port. And so mixed up within the etymology of Lakenheath there, we can start to translate a phrase, landing place of the stream people, or the landing place of Lacca's people, if Lacca might be a personal name. And so this then gives us a context perhaps for the cemetery excavation and for the interpretation of that being one of the earliest settlement sites. And so this notion that we have the landing place of the stream people would sit very closely with this notion of pioneers making their ways up the rivers and coming into the western part of the Fen Edge. Of course, it's hypothesis, but it does tell a good story. Now, just a couple of other examples that we can look at. One of the major clues that we have to the nature of the early Anglo-Saxon landscape are place names that end in ham. And you can see that just highlighted in yellow on the screen here. And this ham ending denotes a village or a manor or an estate. And these ham endings tend to be some of the slightly earlier settlements and some of the slightly higher status settlements. Once you start to spot them on the map, you'll start to see them everywhere you go. But just to break down one of our local examples, we can look at Barnham, where I was the other day, with a whole different project, surveying Cold War archaeology as it happens, but we'll leave that to one side. So Barnham is one of these ham place names, and the barn element here is thought to come from Bjorn, and that's obviously a personal name, but in Old English, Bjorn can also mean a hero or a warrior. And so when we look at it with the ham place name element, we can see that Barnham is perhaps Bjorn's homestead or village, and possibly the warrior homestead or village. And of course, I mentioned doing a Cold War archaeological survey. Perhaps we're still seeing those warriors carrying on right the way through to the present day. But I've also put, those of you who are a bit more eagle-eyed, I've also put on the left-hand side there an illustration from the Hobbit, from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which, as you can see in the label at the bottom right-hand corner, is Bjorn's Hall. Those of you who know your Tolkien perhaps will realise that although he's a famous author, primarily he was Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, and much of the elements of the story of The Hobbit and many of the names from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are taken from Old English and brought across. And so the character of Bjorn, who is a mighty warrior, lives in a hall like this, which perhaps resembles some of the halls we might see around here. And if we were to give his settlement a name, it might be called Barnham, of course, if we were going to take it the other way. Now, those ham place names I mentioned are widely distributed across the landscape. And this is a map from the Norfolk Historical Atlas, again, just showing you the distribution of ham place names. The red dots are certain, the open dots are slightly less certain, where they've become corrupted over time and they may or may not be a ham place name. And you can see just from this basic distribution, which is shown against the larger river valleys, not the minor tributaries, that there is a correlation there, or a limited correlation there at least, between these early settlements and river valleys. And again, that serves to emphasize, as we said all along, that we're seeing people traversing the river network and settling into the wider landscape. I can show you the corresponding map from the Suffolk Historical Atlas. Again, those of you who saw the last session, I used the historical atlases for Norfolk and Suffolk a lot. They're both very, very useful reference volumes indeed, full of maps like this relating to all sorts of different periods. And I'll include the details of those on the reading list. And so again, within Suffolk, you can see this broad distribution of the ham place names as the solid black circles. We won't worry about too much about the ing names, but that comes into that ingas element that I mentioned earlier on. And again, you can see that they're widely distributed throughout the landscape. Now, moving on from ham names, we come to ton names. And the ton is the flip side, if you like, to the ham place name element. So the ton means an enclosure or a farmstead or a village, and tends to be a subsidiary settlement to the ham. And so, for example, it tends to be a bit more simple, a bit more basic. And so, for example, one of our local ones, we've got Santon, which is quite easy. So the San is sand, as we might expect in the Brecks. The Tun obviously gives us a settlement, and that translates then as sandy farm. Perhaps not that illustrative of what's going on, but it gives us a flavour of perhaps the lower status of this particular settlement. It doesn't have a particular person's name associated with it. It doesn't have warrior status, for example. It's of a lower social order. Some other examples that we can just pick from the map at random. We've got Croxton, perhaps Crook's Farm. Oops, and that might be the only one, hang on. And then we've got the map here of Tun names, which again contrasts with the ham names and gives us a slightly more dense distribution. There are more Tun names than ham names. It seems that we have a major Tun at the centre, if you like, and then outlying, a major ham, sorry, at the centre, and outlying Tuns surrounding it. So you can see a slightly more densely populated landscape of Tun names. But again, I hope you can see from that map that we do have a riverine distribution. Again, it's the river valleys that are proving the hotspots for this particular settlement. And here's the contrasting map from Suffolk, again, giving you that distribution correlated against the rivers.